Hi everyone, this is Mr. Spinali, and today I will be reading, this is actually a typo, I will actually be reading a big portion of Stave 3 to you, and we're going to start by concluding our work with the Cratchit's Christmas dinner, and then we're going to move on to the nephew's Christmas party. Notice that we do skip over a couple pages with some details that aren't really essential to the main idea of Stave 3. As we're reading, please make sure that you follow along with the screen, that you listen to all of the directions and pause when you should, and you should have a copy of your copy of the story and your double journal notes out with you throughout the reading to make sure that you have everything that you need. If you have any questions, make sure to email me, and otherwise, enjoy. Alright. So we left off right here in class, so we're going to pick up right here. And remember that the Cratchits have just had their meal, and it's a very kind of meager, weak feast, but certainly one that goes very well appreciated. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. So this is basically their nice china kind of for the event, and as you can see, it's clearly not a lot, and it kind of indicates, again, we can infer that they're not really wealthy. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnut on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," Scrooge said with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." I want to point out something here. Please, in your notes, in your double journal notes, copy down this quote and note that it's personification. The future is capitalized here as if the future is an actual person, which we'll see later in the story. And basically the ghost is reminding Scrooge here that there's a chance the boy may die. "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head over his own words, quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked. Can't you, until you have discovered what surplus is and where it is, will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Think about that quote. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit. "I wish I had him here. I give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have good appetite for it." "My dear, the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. From the mere relief of Scrooge, the bayful being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, a full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. In other words, Bob Cratchit is trying to find a good-paying job for his son Peter. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as you, Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. I'm going to ask you to pause here, and while you're pausing, please take a moment to update your double journal notes with any quotes you have. Try to aim for 3 to 4 quotes from just this section, and then in that right-hand column, you should be explaining what you're thinking as you read. So pause here and take notes, and I'll see you in a moment. What we're going to pick up now is on page 44 in your book. And it's just before Scrooge meets or goes to visit his nephew Fred. And remember his relationship with Fred as indicated at the beginning. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secret, as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. Laughed Scrooge's nephew. If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustrously. He said the Christmas was a humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. In other words, they're always very honest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with the dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripple little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against them. Pause your notes and copy down this quote from his nephew and explain what you think it means. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by the lamplight. Well, I am very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast and had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. Such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew reveled in another laugh, and it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with an aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find his own thoughts, either in his mouldy office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year, and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein of leaving his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring at what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell in the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among the other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness and love for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. I want you to think about this paragraph and copy down a part of this paragraph that you think is important, and add this to your notes. I also want you to go back and add any quotes that you want to discuss tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll finish the scene with the nephew, and we'll go over the quotes that you picked in a student-led discussion. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow.